Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with the next update to the U.S. 2022 House Representatives election. So, I'll just start off the bat here, and I will apologize. I said earlier I was going to try to do a best case scenario for the Democrats here. I didn't quite get that finished. I was quite busy this week. But I did get part of the way there. I calculated a confidence interval, which is part of figuring out the best case scenario for them. I know I've said in the past, I'm not a big fan of confidence intervals because it's hard to assess if it's technically correct. Because, yes, objectively speaking, the math is right, but I'm not doing a statistically valid thing in my projection. It's not based off random samples really anymore. Like, the core is polls, but I do a bunch of post-poll math that is not based purely on statistics. So it's it's questionable in this the more detailed model, but I'm doing it anyways because that's the only way you could possibly figure out a best case scenario for the Democrats. I guess, or the Republicans, technically, but we'll get into that in a minute. And I'll also note, I have said previously that the 250s would be not necessarily impossible, but extremely remarkable. The Republicans get there right now. They are polling that high with the model. And I'm personally a bit on the fence if this is actually the range they're getting. We are talking about quite a big win here. This is about 41 seat pickup for the Republicans. And it's not unheard of. There have been bigger wins by the Democrats and the Republicans before. And by bigger wins, I mean a higher total number of seats or even percentage of seats. But in the last 30 years or so, this would be getting close to the top. And this would be the best Republican performance since 1928 right now. So not unheard of, but quite large. But before we get in the rest of that, I will just go over what has changed since last week. Starting in the Northeast here, Rhode Island is slipped a little. It looks more than it does because it's went from 60 plus margin to 55 to 60 margin, but we really went from like 61 to like 59.5. So we're talking about a pretty small change in Rhode Island, but it crosses a color boundary, so it looks a bit more steep. If I was doing this, ideally, and I mean, if I was using just complete software to do this, I might actually have like a smooth gradient here and not these cutoff boundaries, but for various reasons, I've not had time this year to make software actually auto-color a map and do smooth gradient. It is possible, don't get me wrong, it's just, well, it takes time and I haven't had time to do that. I've been investing my time to make models better, not make maps prettier. That said, continue here. New York, the Republicans picked up 2. This, I feel like, is probably more realistic. I think the Republicans only having 7 in New York and Democrats with 19 seemed unlikely given where the seats are, where the competitiveness, where the state of the race is. This feels more realistic to me. I didn't change anything with the model here. It's just the polling is now reflecting what I think is actually happening. So, that's good. Moving into the Midwest, because really not much else has changed over here in the Northeast. Michigan is now within margin of error, leaning Republican for popular vote, but seat totals remain unchanged. Illinois is Democrats have picked up vote share and have taken a seat. Again, this is kind of like New York. I think last week we're ahead at 10-7. Seemed extremely unlikely. If you actually look at the map in Illinois, Republicans winning 7 seats would pretty much require them winning everything that doesn't touch Chicago, which isn't impossible, but even the suburb, I'm going to phrase this, it doesn't touch downtown Chicago, like Chicago core. But even the suburbs of Chicago are quite Democrat historically, so that seems very ambitious, and I didn't think that was really going to happen. 11-6 still seems ambitious. It's pretty much winning every riding that doesn't touch the suburbs of Chicago meaningfully, which is still pretty aggressive because Illinois, upstate Illinois, upstate whatever, northern Illinois here is quite Democrat, even if you ignore Chicago. If you ignore this little corner here, the rest of North is fairly Democrat still. Southern Illinois is, sure, deep Republican, but that's typically how rural areas work, except wild snowflake states like Vermont, which completely buck every trend in the nation. Continuing here, moving into the South, Republicans picked up a seat in Virginia. They have also picked up a seat in Florida, and they've picked up 3 seats in Texas, which I feel like is wrong. But as always, I don't actively change my model's results, and generally try to avoid doing specific modeling for a particular area unless it's clearly and obviously warranted. So I don't do like specific seat level stuff for Texas, for example, even though I think some of these seats are probably being erroneously called now. I have done that for, say, Vermont, because if you just plug in the raw data, Vermont should be like Indiana red. Vermont's not that, and for various reasons, the people in Vermont, if you've ever met someone from Vermont or have been to Vermont yourself, they are, you'll understand, they're it's not surprising that the people there are Democrats. When you meet them, you're like, that makes sense. But if you look at them from a demographic level, it doesn't make sense. It's one of those weird trend-bucking places where all the trends say it should be a solid Republican state, but all the people there are not what a solid Republican voter would be. So, it's pretty clear nationally. They elect Bernie Sanders as a senator, and he's probably the most socialist politician in the U.S. that actually wins elections. So, there you go. The other one that I had to do some slight tweaking to is in New Mexico, because the Republican seat in New Mexico, which they have held for a bit now, is basically called as the same as every other seat in New Mexico, which seems unlikely that they would lose the seat in the wave year. That, yes, they only picked it up in 2020, sure, but losing it in a wave year when they're gaining seats in the rest of the West, actually pretty much every other state in the country, seems weird, so I am treating that one slightly differently. I could be wrong there, but I'm extremely doubtful, and especially if you look at PVI ratings, it is a tilt R district, and it's like plus 6R PVI, so my model says it should be, or if you don't do any of the corrections I've done, the model says it should be a blue seat, but I've done corrections to it specifically there because that doesn't pass mustard. And yeah, maybe I could be doing that in places like Texas or other places where some of the areas around Dallas and Houston, but that starts getting really finicky, and I don't really like doing that. But Vermont and that one seat in New Mexico, it seems, well, Vermont is pretty clear. Vermont's just a complete outlier, and that one seat in New Mexico seems to be the outlier in the other direction. Continuing with the rest of the West here, well, there's really not too many changes here. There's a pickup by the Republicans in California. I don't trust Oregon still, the map here. I haven't updated the map to a much higher fidelity analysis. I've not had time this week. I've been busy. So we didn't get that. So I'm still a bit sus on Oregon. I'm a little less sus right now that Oregon is might vote plurality red, because it looks like looking at the gubernatorial race, for example, and looking at the general climate for the generic ballot, I don't think it's that unlikely in fact, but I feel like the seat distribution I don't feel like is right. Maybe I'm underestimating Republicans, but I think I'm underestimating the Democrats in Oregon. I could be wrong. I'm going to try next week to get that Oregon done correctly. I make no promises, though, but that is my goal. That, and along, I'm going to try to do the confidence, the best case scenario for the next update, more or less. But let us bring up to trend. So, as we can see, since August here, I've had about August 7th, I had 6-point lead. Now I'm looking at about an 8-point lead, and here we have my confidence interval, by the way. So the confidence interval is, the way I would read this is it's 53.8 plus or minus 2.9, and 46 plus or minus 2.7. So from August 7th to October 23rd, with the sole exception of October 9th, where I had a bug, we were looking at somewhere between 5 and 6 points for the Republicans, edging up to maybe 6.5 on the 23rd. It's been pretty consistent. What we really see, though, in the last week is the polls are starting to surge heavily for the Republicans. We're looking at a huge surge is just occurring now. Now, I think my model might be slightly overestimating the Republicans right now because there's been a lot of polls in the last week that haven't considered third-party voters. And it could also be the case I might also slightly overestimate the Democrats as a result, but I think it's mostly Republicans benefiting from this. Basically, most pollsters in the U.S. really just ask Democrat, Republican, undecided. They don't say Democrat, Republican, other, undecided. So you can't actually consider the undecideds as quote-unquote other. You will have a wildly wrong result. If you do that, I would be having third parties at like 5-6%, which I'm not sure has ever happened in a congressional race, for that matter. And if it has, it's extremely, like as a national level, like 6% third parties I don't think has ever happened. And if it has, it's wildly anomalous. There's only been a few times where third-party candidates have done well in the president, such as Ross Perot or way back Teddy Roosevelt. But those were particularly anomalous circumstances with mediocre opposition, really, and a quite well-run third-party campaign. I don't see any of that going on right now, so I think I'm partially underestimating the third parties, but I think that's mostly the polls to blame. I'm blaming the polls there. So we will see come election day how wrong this is. I think I'm mostly overestimating the Republicans here. If I were to be a betting man, I would say it's probably 53-46-1. That is my bet. But I obviously don't have, the polls are not saying that, so we're not getting that, but we get what we get. Can't say I'm super excited about the polls not properly polling. Some companies do, but even good U.S. poll companies, and by good I mean ones that have good track records, still don't do it, so a bit miffed about that. Now we're just going to pop over to Real Clear here for a second just to help illustrate the most recent trend, because I don't have any nice graphs for this. I could generate some like mediocre Excel graphs or whatever. We didn't do that. So this is Real Clear. This is the last poll by all the major pollsters that they consider. They don't consider every pollster. I consider every pollster they have. I don't necessarily consider, they don't have all the pollsters I have. I have like Big Data Poll, for example. They don't have that. And this is just the quote-unquote naive average. They're not doing any other fancy statistical math. They're just taking all these polls, taking all the leads, and they're averaging it. It is perfectly credible. There's nothing wrong with what they do, but you have to know what they're doing. their numbers are going to trail mine because they're not forecasting error. They're not doing any other kind of fancy stuff, fancy math that I'm doing. So theirs are always going to be different than mine because they're not doing anything fancy. I'm doing things fancy. If my fancy things are stupid and wrong, I'll be wrong. But I don't really think so. But you can see here, we had really August to early or late September. The polls were saying, "No, it's neck and neck." That was always hogwash. That was dumb. The polls in August to early September are always really bad. This was super hot noise. I was considering the polls, and they were putting in my model. My model does do a bunch of math and do a bunch of stuff that airs out polling error, and this was probably tons of polling error. Because what traditionally happens here is the Democrat vote share, typically, in the last 10 years, isn't wrong in these polls. They just somehow, for some reason, wildly underestimate Republican turnout and or Republican vote intensity. This is really bad with Economist YouGov, specifically those two. YouGov with other newspapers is not as bad, but YouGov with Economist is really bad in that they underestimate how many Republicans are going to vote. I think their samples are normally like 500 Democrats, 400 Independents, 300 Republican range. Like that kind of stuff. That's not what voting pools look like. There's never been an election where there was 5-3 Democrat-Republican votes. Normally, it's somewhere around 40 to 35 range as a percent. So we're talking about very narrow Democrat voter turnout advantage compared to Republican. But YouGov doesn't have that. So YouGov numbers are always wildly tilted Democrat from what they actually should be based off of what exit polls say turnout actually is. And just to go here, so some like credible polls from decent pollsters that don't have third parties. Trafalgar, Data for Progress, Emerson, Harvard-Harris, like decent pollsters that have decent track records. They don't have third parties. So Rasmussen and YouGov do, name two, but well, we already talked about YouGov. Rasmussen is fine, but if there's only one pollster with good track record having third parties, you're going to skew your results, as you can see, because I just named 5 or 4 that don't. So only in this last week here, I think this might be overestimating Republicans a little bit now because the third parties have completely dropped off, and I just don't see it. They're normally around 1%, and I don't really see why this election they wouldn't be anywhere close to that. That seems weird. That said, in general terms, I will always say, to be in full transparency, when you're looking at my model, when you're looking at my results, historically, barring polls being wrong or barring me missing polls, like in the most recent Quebec election, I missed about 5 polls for my last update to the election day because they all decided to release them on Sunday before the election. Because screw me, I guess. Who releases polls on weekends? Anyways. I'm generally really good at popular vote. Even in the Quebec election, once I... if you looked at my postmortem and I correct all this stuff and I add the polls that I missed, I'm in the same ballpark as everyone else. It wasn't my best popular vote performance, but generally speaking, my popular vote performance is quite solid. So, barring the polls just being wrong here, or polls coming out after I finish my video on the 6th, this I'm very confident in. I think we're going to see something like this. Not too surprising. The one thing I will always caution, looking at my model, and this is based on just history and track record, and this is by no means to denigrate myself here, because a 90-95% hit rate for seats is good, but we're talking about 435 seats, so On the 435 seats, you should expect me to get about 40 wrong. Well, 20 to 40, to be fair. So you should look at the Democrat and Republican seat totals and put a plus or minus 20 on them. That is the appropriate response. So if you consider that, this is a really naive best case scenario. I'm going to do a better one at least next week, maybe Tuesday if I have time. We'll see. I might also do a different country on Tuesday. We'll see. I'm waiting to see if more polls come out. Anyways, the most naive version of the best case scenario for the Democrats here would be, roughly speaking, 202 Democrat seats and 204 Democrat seats and 231 GOP seats. That's their naive best case scenario. I'm going to do a better one that is going to have a map, because maps are nice and they look cool. We're going to have a map, but not having a map, the numbers for the best case would be probably the naive way of looking at this would be 204 to 231. I'm going to do a better one when it's more detailed and one that is more sophisticated, not just this most naive version of it. Well, that's kind of what to expect for the Congress here. In the best case scenario for the Republicans, again, naive version would be like 280, which, if that happens, you can't call this a red wave election if they get 280. That would be like a 70-seat pickup. That would be like a red tsunami, Democrat collapse. Like, that would be the biggest rout probably in a midterm ever. Because keep in mind, we're not talking like a 70 pickup when the Republicans are down at 80 seats. They're already at 210. They already have most of the toss-up leaning R seats. In other words, a lot of midterms, what happens is in the presidential race, the winning president carries a bunch of Congress people across the line who shouldn't win. You have districts that are like R+6, for example, or like R+3, and the Democrats win those seats, say 2012. And then the midterms in 2014, the Republicans win those seats back, and then they win a few other ones that are closer, like flat or D+2 kind of stuff. That would be a normal wave. And then you might get a 70-seat pickup, but you're going from like 180 to 250. 70 seats still a lot, but that's kind of what you normally see. But we're talking the Republicans are at 213. They've already have all of the seats that Biden didn't carry any weak Democrat candidates across the line. The Democrat congressional districts or congressional caucus doesn't have extremely vulnerable members. There's a couple, there's the odd ones here or there, but most of them are in toss-up, like true toss-up or D-leaning seats. They have very, 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 very few, and it might be single digits, who are in Republican-leaning seats. And I would say Republican-leaning are more than R+2, and D-leaning are more than D+2. Anything R to D+2 is toss-up, really. 2 percentage point swing is trivial, basically. So, right now, even with my model as is, the Republicans winning 40 is quite a big win. The best case scenario, naively here, is even wilder. I don't think it's even remotely going to happen. You would be like, yes, the economy sucks, inflation's high, Biden's quite a divisive president, at least as divisive as Trump was. His approval rating sucks. He's done a bunch of things that have probably made the problem worse, namely with gas prices. And spending, really. But ignoring all of that, that's a huge win. I'm a 254 is a big win. And yes, there's all sorts of fundamentals. There's all sorts of bad things going on in the US that should, ignoring everything else, cause the president to lose the midterms. Divisive presidents never win. There was always hopium and silliness that the polls were saying that the House was close. That was silly. That was bad polling. That was nonsense. The House wasn't close. The only thing that was marginally close were some of the Senate races, because up until recently, really with the Oz debate, the Oz-Fetterman debate, Oz wasn't a great candidate, and the only reason he's doing decent now in the polls is because Fetterman is, well, he had a stroke and barely can speak, so the man, to be honest, seeing how bad he was in that debate, I don't really know why the Democrats nominated the guy, but I don't know. I don't know what the details there. I wasn't following the Democrat primary in Pennsylvania too closely. Then you have a couple other places like Georgia where both candidates have both parties kind of a weak candidate. So the Senate was always was more in doubt, even in a wave year, because there were some weak candidates in key seats. But the House was never in doubt. Anyone saying the House was in doubt are crazy. And I'll be honest, even though the Senate was more in doubt, it was never going Democrat. There really has never been a scenario where the Democrats were going to win the Senate. Their best case scenario really was a hold Georgia, pick up Pennsylvania, lose Nevada, which is a tie still. And now it's looking like lose Nevada, lose Pennsylvania, maybe hold Georgia, depends on what the second round sees, and they're likely going to lose Arizona. So we're now looking at 53 probably, but we'll get more into that on Thursday when I do the next Senate update. But that might be the final Senate update, actually. Yeah, that'll be the final Senate update. I might do an emergency one if polls wildly change, but we'll get into that on Thursday. So I guess just to wrap this up here, because I don't want to go too long. We're already at 27 minutes at the time of saying this. So we didn't get much analysis here. We're just going through what the model says and what's going on. Okay. But to be fair, there's really not much to analyze here. The campaign has been remarkably flat. Nothing really has changed. It's pretty much the same trajectory, which is, again, why I really don't... the polls in August, September were just nonsense. And I think any viewer watching me should be really cautious at looking at any modelers or forecasts that were saying the House was even remotely close. The Republicans were always going to win. The question has just been, how much was this win going to be? If you saw a different modeler, a different aggregator saying, oh, it could be 230 to like 260, okay, that's fair, that's reasonable. I won't critique that person too hard. I'm going to, in the postmortem, compare myself to other people, but in that regard, that person, that modeler, fair enough. If they were saying the Democrats had any chance of winning the House, that's nonsense. They didn't. They had no chances. This is why percent chances are stupid. Because that person, I'm going to throw 538 out here. 538, for example, had a percent chance that the Democrats could win the House for a while. I'm not sure if they still do. I haven't looked recently, but they had a percent chance. They never had a percent chance. Percent chance implies that scenario can realistically happen. When you're talking about House seats, that's not really how that works. House seats never wildly diverge from models. There's so many of them that even the fact that a close race is in essence, a probabilistic thing from a macro standpoint. If you have 50 close races and they're all 50-50, statistically speaking, you should get 25-25. The only races where percent chances are even meaningful, I don't like them, but even if they're meaningful, are like Senate races or presidential races where you're talking about very few places can swing a race. Okay, but the control of the House, you're talking about dozens and dozens and dozens of good die rolls. That doesn't happen. There was never a chance. And historically, that shouldn't surprise you. Can you think of the last time, other than 2002, where the incumbent president gained ground in the midterms? In 2002, bucks all the trends, because that wasn't because Bush was great. That was because 9/11. Nothing has happened that is anywhere as dramatic or consequential as 9/11, thankfully. That'd be horrible. So it should be obvious that the Congress was always going to go this way. But with that, I bid you adieu, and I will see you Tuesday with either something different or best case to worst case scenarios. We'll see. Depends on how much time I have and what polls come out soon. And just to comment here, because it occurs to me now, I will be live streaming, probably, almost certain, how I'm going to phrase this. I will be live streaming the election results on November 8th, and I'll have a live stream discussion about what's going on, who's winning, stuff like that. Go through the coverage. I don't know the exact time yet, but knowing what I know about the U.S. schedule, probably like 8 to 11 or something Eastern time. But again, we'll see. I will get you more details later when I get into that. It is relatively close, so I just want to announce that live stream is going to be happening, so you should keep an eye out for it. Otherwise, though, if you like the video, like, share, subscribe, comment below what you think. If you think I'm wrong, off base, if you like what I'm saying, you have some point or some local insight. Again, I always love local insight, your perspective on elections. I cannot stress enough how much it makes my job easier to see anecdotal information. Talking to people makes everything about what I do easier. Polls tell you a number, people tell you a story. You need the story to understand what's happening. So, always, always, always encourage you to tell me any details you thought about the election, you see yourself, your perspective on things. Always love that. And with that, I bid you adieu, and I will see you next time.